Small businesses help power American innovation. Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Bill Hewlett, and David Packard. The images of these entrepreneurs working in their garages is very evocative of the American spirit of entrepreneurship. Government programs like the Small Business Innovation Research, or SBIR, are very much focused on fueling that kind of entrepreneurship in small businesses. Understanding small business performance is key to making these programs work. After a brief overview of small business trends, I'll sit down with the Honorable Emily Murphy, former administrator of the U.S. General Services Administration, or GSA, and the founder and CEO of Government Procurement Strategies, for a discussion. I'm your host, Jerry McGinn, and welcome to another episode of All About the Base. The use of agile acquisition of vehicles like Other Transactions Authorities, or OTAs, and SBIR grants have exploded over the past several years. However, because there's no measurement of what is produced by such investment innovation, the extent to which the nation is benefiting from these contract instruments is principally anecdotal. We need better measurements of outcomes to understand how these efforts are being, the value of these instruments, and as we rely on them as engines of innovation. So looking at the amount of federal money obligated to companies in groupings based on firms' contracting revenues. So looking at this graph, the first segment looks at 2009 to 2020, 2019. The second smallest grouping, or those companies in yellow, have the largest share of dollars obligated, almost 30%. And the largest companies, those are in blue, that have over $1 billion in revenue, have the smallest shares of dollars obligated, between 13 and 24%. However, towards the last few years, from 21 through 23, the largest share of dollars obligated goes to the largest companies, and the smallest companies, those with $25 million or less in revenue in green, they have approximately between 18 and 20%. As you can see, the smallest companies, those with less than $25 million in annual revenue, have approximately 20% of the dollars obligated in all years. For DoD obligations, rather than other federal, the largest companies have the largest share of dollars obligated, and the smallest companies have the smallest shares of dollars obligated. So roughly around 20% in all years. So looking at, as I mentioned in the beginning, the image of small businesses powering, in garages across the nation is incredibly evocative of our entrepreneurial spirit. But the reality is that the preponderance of small business work that is obligated by the government is not an innovation. Small businesses do participate in innovation as government contractors through SBIRs and other efforts. However, as illustrated in this graph, looking at 2023 DoD obligations that going principally to small businesses, the preponderance of work dominated by smalls includes civil engineering, software installation and programming, utilities installation and repair, waste removal, administrative services, and non-technical manufacturing. Though important to the functioning of the government, this work is largely unrelated to innovation. The key takeaway is that small businesses are dominant in DoD contracts and facilities and services, as well as in office computer support services. These contracts are profitable for privately held small businesses, and because they have lower overhead rates and smaller demands for profit sharing. This work is critically important for the department, as it is for other agencies that have similar kind of spend examples. And it spurs, it does not contribute to small business innovation specifically. If the government wants more innovation out of small businesses, they need to change their contracting approaches to incentivize different outcomes. So you see that here in small business innovation in this chart, which looks at SBIR specifically. If you look obligations across the government in SBIR have increased from $3 to $6 billion over the past decade. The largest amount goes to DoD, about half. That's because they spend the most on research and development. But HHS spends a lot as well on that. So you see that there's quite a bit of spend on small business innovation, but it has grown over the past decade. One of the challenges, though, is that, as many of you know, Small Business Innovation Research, SBIR, and its companion program, the Small Business Technology Transfer, those programs have their authorization expired at the end of September. And right now there's a big debate going on in Congress on how to reauthorize this critical authority. To discuss this issue and many other important issues in small business, I will now bring in my former colleague and the former GSA administrator, Emily Murphy, who's one of the nation's leading experts on small business issues. Emily, it's great to have you here, and really want to get your perspective on current trends in small business policy, how it differs from the previous administration. Where do you think it's going in the future?
Jerry, it's great to be here with you. And a lot happened in 2025 for small business. A lot of it was actually very, very positive also. And I'd start with the revolutionary FAR overhaul. The administration came out and said, we want to go in and look at all the regulations covering government contracting, gave themselves a very aggressive timeline for issuing model deviations. And in doing so, though, reduced a lot of the regulatory burden that applies to small business. For example, for commercial item contracting, they've reduced the number of clauses by about 30%.
Wow.
I mean, that's a serious, it applies to small and large businesses, but for small businesses, that's a really big deal. If you're trying to bring new entrants in, that makes contracting with the government much more interesting, much more attractive. Still is government contracting, it's not going to be without regulations, but it is a step in the right direction. Additionally, with the System for Award Management, the registration process, they announced that they were going to make changes to that registration process to make it easier for companies to come in. Now, the systems have to catch up with that, and that's always the challenge, but it positions small businesses for more work going forward. Additionally, going back to commercial contracting, they decided that they were going to really push the use of simplified acquisition procedures for commercial type contracts. In the past, you had the authority, but you rarely saw it exercised above the simplified acquisition threshold. So until it was $250,000 for most of last year, it went up to $350,000. However, the administration came out through that RFO process and said, no, we think we can do this at larger amounts for commercial items, especially around technology, services, up to $9 million. So incredible opportunities for small businesses. Even the increase of the micro purchase threshold from $10,000 to $15,000 brings in a lot of new opportunities for small business. Mm-hmm. At the same time, though, you've got the dollars going to small businesses tell a very interesting story, which a lot of companies were nervous about what 2025 was going to mean for small business. And we don't have the official government numbers yet, but I went on to FPDS a couple days ago.
And that's the
Federal Procurement Data System, sorry. And using SBA's rules, which they've got programmed in there.
Small Business Administration, sorry.
Using the Small Business Administration's rules, I went in and I tried to pull the results for 24 and 25 and saw that there was a pretty significant increase in small business contracting dollars. So prime contracts being awarded to small businesses went from about 27% in fiscal 24 to about 28.7% in fiscal 25.
Wow.
That's an increase of over $30 billion to small businesses. And then you start looking at the sub-programs and where did that growth happen? And it was interesting, the place that you see growth was primarily in the 8A program. In fact, small disadvantaged business is where you actually have a goal, statutory goal of 5%. And that's itself a change from the Biden administration, because in the Biden administration, they made a decision to raise the SDB goal over time from 5% to 15%. The very beginning of the Trump administration, President Trump reduced it back down to 5%. But if you look at the dollars that went to SGBs and then to 8As from 24 to 25, you get a very interesting story, which is the dollars to SDBs themselves went from about $25 billion, or about $76 billion in 24 to $95 billion in 2025. It's an increase of essentially $20 billion.
Wow.
And then the question is, well, how did they make those awards? And you'll see that all of the increase came in the 8A program, or almost all of it, because they went from $25 billion to $45 billion. So that increase, really, a lot of the increase we saw in small business contracting happened using the 8A program, which is especially interesting given all of the oversight that's taking place of the 8A program right now. And raises the question of, well, why was 8A so attractive in 25? And much of it might be because there were holds on spending and a lot of reviews of contracts. And so with a reduced workforce and a very tight time frame, given the fact that that budgets didn't make it out to agencies on time, and then there was additional review of contracts, 8As became an easy button for sole source. So that might explain it, especially because when you look at the other socioeconomic programs, you'll see that the small service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses saw a decrease in their percentage of work. HUBZone saw a slight increase in their percentage of work. Women saw a decrease in the percentage of work. And small businesses overall, their increase can almost entirely be accounted for by the 8A SDB increases. So that seemed to have been the program of choice in 25.
So there was an announcement recently by Secretary Hegseth in the Department of War about looking closely at the 8A programs or small disadvantaged programs. But this is, as you said, going across government agencies. They're looking at where the spend is going to see if we're spending it in the right kind of way. Is that correct?
That's correct. And there's a lot of focus at every agency on making sure that the dollars going out the door are in line with the administration's priorities and that they meet the requirements of that agency or department. Absolutely normal. I think that the Secretary's announcement on 8A, when you actually go and read the memo that accompanied it, it's about 8As, but it's also about small business set-aside contracts. And it's just the last in a series, or the latest in a series of reviews of 8A contracting that really go back to about 2023. If you remember, in 2023, there was a court case, it was the Ultima decision, that challenged the basis of award for some 8A contracts. It was a case brought against USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the Small Business Administration. And they said, you can't keep presuming that certain categories are socially disadvantaged. And SBA had, at that point in time, had a group of categories where they said, if you fit into one of these categories, we'll presume that you have social disadvantage. Court came back and said, no, you can't do that anymore. You haven't updated these in decades. You have to come up with a better way of determining social disadvantage. And that SBA then put a pause on the 8A program, and they went back and they said, all right, we're going to do an individual case determination for every single applicant who is not a tribal entity or an Alaska Native corporation where they're statutorily entitled to the 8A status. So we saw that happen in 23. You saw the 8A program sort of take a little bit of a hit at that point in time, but then you saw it start to pick up again in 24. And then clearly in 25, it's done very well. But you then started to see other agencies come in and say, wait a second, we're seeing contracts being awarded using the 8A program that might not be following the rules. USAID came in with some issues around fraud. Department of Treasury had its review. The SBA then came out and announced that they were going to do a complete review of the entire program. They even went out in December and required all 8A contractors to provide them with financial records dating back 3 years, and just expelled a bunch of companies from the 8A program who hadn't turned those in on time. Now you see the Secretary Hegseth coming out and saying, wait a second, I want a review, line by line review of all contracts that are 8A sole source above $20 million. Well, most 8A contracts can't be $20 million. Most 8A contracts are capped and have depending on what they're for, but none of them are even at $10 million. The only place you have those sole source awards above $20 million is with the tribal organizations. So the original thought when people were watching the announcement and there was the video that was on Twitter was, all right, is that what we're focusing on? Are we focusing on the tribal organizations? But then when you read the memo, it says we're going to look at those. We're going to look at competitive 8As as well, above $20 million. And that's interesting because when we talked about the FAR, one of the changes the FAR made was to say that we're not going to do sole source 8As if there isn't a multiple award contract that has 8As as part of it, and you could do an 8A competitive award instead going forward. So, but these are also going to come under scrutiny. And we're also going to look at any set-aside contracts to small businesses or subcategories of small businesses that are above $20 million. So, and then the rationale for this is that some of these contracts are pass-through contracts, that the small business isn't doing something with them. And that takes us back to the 2013, 2014 investigations and changes.
So suffice to say, there are lots of opportunities for small businesses today and tomorrow, but there's also going to be a lot of re-examination of some of these set-aside programs to see if they're fulfilling their statutory mission.
To make sure they're fulfilling their statutory mission and that the companies that are engaged in providing the services, are engaged to provide the services, are really contributing a substantial amount of the work.
Great. So I wonder if we could turn back to the issue I was talking about in my presentation around innovation and small businesses, and specifically the SBIR program. So SBIR, as I mentioned, is currently not authorized. So what does that mean, and what are some of the models that they're looking to get the SBIR program back on track?
Well, I mean, the SBIR program is a great example of a program that really encourages innovation. And every study that has come out of the Department of, it was then the Department of Defense, out of HHS, finds that for dollars invested in a SBIR, we end up getting a very good return on investment as a nation. That is not to say that every SBIR contract, and they can be grants or awards at phase 1, phase 2, these are small dollar value. It's not to say all of them succeed. And in fact, some companies come back and they go again and again to the same SBIR. And that's where there seems to be some controversy happening. But, and that's something that's worth investigating, but it also is worth realizing that stops and starts in the program don't just mean that from the time that a program it loses its authorization, that it doesn't start up right away the day that the authorization comes back in. And if the slide you had up earlier showed that there was a dip in earlier years, and you can actually trace those dips to when there's a lack of reauthorization and there's a delay in the reauthorization process. It sends the wrong signal also to truly innovative companies about whether or not the government is serious and committed to doing business with them.
Yeah, so we've been out almost 3 months or 4 months
Almost
now without authorization, and so there's no new starts essentially. And one of the big controversies they've talked about in one of the competing versions of the reauthorization of SBIR is around getting after SBIR mills. And I mean, are SBIR mills really the problem? And exactly, I mean, it's sort of those are firms that help companies get SBIRs, but there's some debate on whether or not they provide value add. So can you talk a little bit about this issue?
So I understand that the fear is that there are companies out there gaming the system, and that they're just going in and getting the early, this phase 1, the phase 2 grants or contracts without any intention of ever really commercializing or taking that project to the next level. And there may be some bad actors out there. But there also were a lot of companies where they're doing R&D and their first try doesn't work, and so they have to come back and try again. And they make progress, and then you keep, and it's a cycle. I tried at one point in time to figure out how many times did Edison fail before he invented the light bulb. If you go online, you can find any number you want because they are so all over the board. But I think the point I took from it was you can't really say, okay, you get 5 chances to invent a light bulb, or it would all be sitting in the dark. Instead, what I think the issue is are we getting performance? Are the companies receiving these SBIR awards actually delivering value? Are they advancing the state of conversation? And sadly, I think it's an area where we don't do a very good job of answering that question. There's a wonderful database of all the SBIR awards, SBIR.gov. And it will tell you what a phase 1 was awarded for, what a phase 2 was awarded for. It will tell you the terms, but it never tells you what came out of those. Mm-hmm. It stops with the phase 2 award. And if you think about it, what we really need to know is, well, what was the result of the phase 2? Did this advance our understanding of an issue, our ability to address a problem? Did this end up ultimately being commercialized either in the government or in the private sector? Did we get the next Roomba out of it? Because Roomba came out of a SBIR. Or was this just something where we abandoned the work after phase 2? Mm-hmm. And I think that it's a harder challenge. I mean, past performance is a hard challenge, even in a much more direct contracting scheme. R&D, it's harder to assess that, and you don't want to necessarily put all of your results out online. But there needs to be a better way for the government to share within the government whether or not a SBIR was successful, and that should probably be a factor in looking at whether or not a company gets the next phase 2 or a follow-on work, and as well as looking at how many of them made it to that phase 3, made it to that commercialization level.
So essentially, starting to better measure outcomes as opposed to looking at some of these other metrics. So that's great to hear. So Emily, thank you so much for your time. It's wonderful to see you again and to have you on the show. And I want to thank our audience for being with us again today. And we'll see you next time. But remember, it's all about the base.